Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome all to this Ride Sharing Institute conversation, part one of a symposium on the topic of tradable mobile emissions rights. I'm Paul Minot, a co-founder and member of the board of the Ride Sharing Institute. Nonprofit and international, the Ride Sharing Institute was incorporated in 2011 in the US as a 501c3 charity. We have board members at the moment in the USA, Germany, and New Zealand. Our purpose is to reduce emissions while improving transportation equity around the world. We do this by encouraging more carpooling and van pooling. Our objective is stronger policy at all levels of government to encourage more pooling. The sooner we increase pooling, the sooner we get the benefits of reduced emissions. We invite collaboration and sharing of knowledge. Welcome to today's conversation. Today's conversation is a departure from our tradition. It's in two parts, and it explores potential policy settings a couple of levels up from our traditional focus. If the concepts we discuss today could be put into policy, demand for travel demand management and our pooling advocacy would almost automatically increase. Today's symposium is part of a project that I'm carrying out with a research grant from the Transportation Group of Engineering New Zealand. I acknowledge and appreciate their support. I also thank my fellow Ride Sharing Institute board members for their enthusiastic support of this conversation topic. And you can see Larry, John, I haven't seen Jesse yet, Jesse Glazer, who are all board members joining us. And finally, I welcome and thank our keynote speakers for this part. Eric Verhoef, please wave. And Keshin Gang. Keshin, please wave. And I'll introduce them more completely in a few minutes. The session's being recorded. After the session, we'll make a highlights video ready for the start of part two of the symposium in about 12 hours' time. So the agenda for today is as follows. First, I will share a pre-recorded 5-minute explainer presentation about the straw man for tradable mobile emissions rights system, or TMERS, in New Zealand. That will be followed by a brief question and answer for clarification only if I've seemed to have missed something out of the explainer. Then the symposium proper will get underway. The purpose is to critique the straw man, drawing on our experts' experience in this general topic area. So Eric and Keshin will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. After each of their speech, I'll ask if there's any further immediate questions, and then after that we'll resolve into a general conversation with the whole group. The idea of our conversations is that they are conversations and you have the opportunity to ask your questions. We've advertised that this is a 90-minute conversation, and our general approach is that if there's still something burning to talk about, we don't turn off at the 90 minutes. Of course, if we run out sooner, we'll stop sooner. Now, I'm going to play the 5-minute video. Bear with me while I get the tech working. Tradable Mobile Emissions Rights System, TMERS, Strawman. For petrol cars, New Zealand is about to switch from petrol tax of 80 cents per litre, of about $2.50 petrol retail price, to a prepaid, distance-based road user charge system called RUC. Petrol cars will join diesel and electric vehicles that already pay RUC. RUC is purchased in 1,000 kilometre blocks at $77 plus admin per 1,000 kilometres, based on the car's odometer reading. It's an offence to drive with an odometer reading above the max dist recorder. New Zealand has an emissions trading scheme It seeks to find the lowest marginal cost of emissions reduction across the whole economy. Fossil-fueled transportation is so highly valued by households and organizations that current and forecast NZETS prices are not expected to cause abatement in light vehicle fleet emissions. Even worse, the switch to RUC will reduce petrol prices by 30%. This will reduce costs for high emissions vehicles, and that's going to cause emissions to rise, and there's nothing in place to offset this, nor to encourage ongoing reductions. To ensure international commitments are met, New Zealand needs to find a way to make transportation participate in emissions reduction. TMERS are tradable rights to buy RUC for fossil-fueled vehicles. Each right would represent 1 kilogram of emissions-related travel. Rights would be created for all allowed light vehicle emissions for the period. There'd be a sinking cap. The number of rights created would reduce each period. Rights would be allocated into individual accounts each period. Owners would use up rights when buying RUC. For example, for a petrol car rated at 234 grams of emissions per kilometre, the owner would use up 234 rights to buy 1,000 kilometres of RUC, in addition to paying the $77 plus admin. If you were short of rights when buying RUC, the owner would buy rights from the market. If having a surplus of rights, they could be gifted, sold privately, sold to the market, or saved. There are many configurable settings for TMERS. We needed to choose some settings to start a discussion. Much debate will be needed to arrive at a socially acceptable system that gets enough votes in a referendum. This strawman proposal includes the following settings. Initial rights creation matches the previous quarter's emissions. Quarterly reductions in the cap are fixed from day one. Quarterly allocations would be to all people who are 16 years of age and over for free. Allocations may be adjusted for equity based on need. There would be no allocations to organizations. The rights would not expire. Revenue from sales of surplus rights is not taxable. Regulated market makers buy and sell rights. Their margin is taxable. Market makers publish buy and sell prices. They must always have stock available. A New Zealand Transport Agency app would make it easy to manage and automate trading. Here are the expected impacts from implementing TMERS. There will be immediate market activity as EV owners and non-drivers will sell the rights that they don't need, and organizations will buy the rights that they need for their light vehicle fleet. People will become more aware of emissions from driving. People who think they might have a surplus will trade cautiously. As subsequent allocations reduce, people and organizations will explore options for maximizing surpluses or minimizing the quantity they need to buy. Organizations will electrify fleets quite quickly, while individuals will adjust their modes of travel more gradually. More shared trips will reduce traffic congestion. Individual interest in electric vehicles will increase, and the target level of emissions reduction will be achieved. Are there any clarifying questions about the straw man before we hear from our experts? Please mute yourself and raise your hand if you've got a question. Graham, go ahead.
Yes, it's not quite clear. You said that the initial allocation would be based on your historical usage. But what happens to someone who's only just acquired a car or someone who...
I'll interrupt you, Graham. The initial allocation is based on the total emissions across the country.
Sorry, I thought you meant each individual.
Cool. I understand how you missed that. That's all right. Martin.
Just a quick one. You reported here that people 16 years old and older get these for free, certain amount. does that mean you have to be citizens in the country, or how do you treat with strangers or visitors coming to your country?
Good question. I'm imagining that all citizens will. I imagine if you're a stranger coming to the country, you'll rent a car and the rental company will have purchased the rights. Graham.
Another question. In your run through, you said that organizations will not get an allocation. By organizations, do you mean commercial enterprises, companies?
Commercial enterprises, city councils, non-profits, they would not, no organization. It would only be to natural people, being people who can vote.
So does this mean those organizations would have to purchase them on the market that would presumably arise?
Absolutely correct. Thank you. Yes. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Eric Verhoef. It's a great pleasure. It's difficult to believe that Eric's seminal paper titled Tradable Permits, Their Potential in the Regulation of Road Transport Externalities, was published in 1997, almost 30 years ago. Eric gave me permission to say that this field of research is the fountain of youth. Eric joins us from the Netherlands, where he holds a full-time professorship in spatial economics at VU University Amsterdam. He holds unpaid ancillary positions as a member of the Advisory Council on Traffic and Transport Models of the Directorate General for Public Works and Water Management in the Netherlands. He's a fellow of the Knowledge Institute for Mobility Policy, a member of the Supervisory Board of the Foundation for Scientific Research on Road Safety, a figurehead of the Dutch Research Agenda's Logistics and Transport Route, and an adjunct professor at Beijing Jiaotong University. Eric will open the symposium discussion. Eric, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. So having said that, Paul, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this event and for inviting me to give a presentation. It's exciting to see how the idea of tradable permits in transport is gaining momentum. I think it's a very promising instrument, even though the promise started as long ago as 1997, as you indicated already. And in this presentation, I will give a brief overview of the economics behind it, the economic motivation for the instrument, how it relates to other instruments to deal with, for instance, emissions of CO2, but also other external costs, as we call them in in economics. So what are external costs? And if you're already familiar with that, apologies, but I thought I'd just start the introduction really with the basics. So the reason why economists have been working on instruments such as CO2 taxes, but also tradable permits for the management of emissions, has to do with the fact that we are facing what we call external cost. And external costs are defined as unpriced negative effects that agents impose upon others. So that can be local pollution, it can be noise, it can be accident risks if we talk about transport. Global warming is a very important one. And also traffic congestion, even though you might think that this is something that road users impose upon one another, the relevant level of analysis for an externality is the individual. And when I join a road, I'm slowing down others. So also that is an externality. And in fact, that was the externality that Arthur Pigou back in 1920, so we are here talking about economic theories of more than a century old. Traffic congestion was the example that he used in explaining why the market fails when we have externalities. Why, in case of external cost, there is overconsumption. And we talk about road transport today. So that would mean overconsumption of transport. Pigou not only gave the, let's say, the analytical framework to show that indeed the market outcome deviates from what one would like to see from the perspective of social welfare. He also provided what has become the knee-jerk reflex of economists when being confronted with external cost, namely the idea to put corrective taxes on in this case, the emissions of CO2. By doing that, individual maximizing behavior will be brought back in line with what one would like to see from the perspective of what is sometimes called broadly defined social welfare, or indeed welfare measures that are currently also known as beyond GDP. So looking at environmental values, looking at societal values that go beyond things that are automatically measured in money. So there's a clear link between those fields of research. There are at least 3 noteworthy aspects about Pigouvian pricing as an instrument to deal with external cost. First of all, it's sometimes referred to as the internalization of externalities, which really means that we bring the externality back into the interest of the individual causing the externality, because the individual is paying for the externality. And that also means that there's a very, from the economic perspective, need NEAT, a need incentive to economize on this externality in the best possible way. So for some road users, it might be traveling less. For others, it might be getting a more fuel efficient cars. People may be more careful looking at the tire pressure, driving style, and so forth. Putting a price on the externality really decentralizes all these behavioral responses that people can have in order to reduce the externality. It is also called the polluter pays principle, and that is, it's logical why it's called that way. Pigou called it that way for efficiency reasons, and it's important to keep in mind that sometimes when people talk about polluter pays principle, they are thinking about the fairness aspect of it. It's fair that people should pay for the pollution that they cause. And although these 2 different considerations, the efficiency consideration that Arthur Pigou had versus the fairness consideration that some others may have, sometimes go hand in hand, it's important to keep in mind that those 2 perspectives on the polluter pays principle may also diverge. So it can serve both the efficiency objectives and the fairness objectives, but then sometimes that may, in some cases, that might also diverge. And that is the first instance where tradable permits, in fact, are more flexible than traditional pricing of externalities. That is because the instrument, and Paul already hinted at it in the video, the instrument allows, through the initial distribution of permits, to really, in a very transparent way, address the fairness and the equity objectives that governments may have when dealing with externality. The distribution of permits gives a very strong instrument that allows the policymaker not only to deal with the efficiency aspect of the overconsumption of, well, CO2 emissions, but also to deal with the fairness of how that should be divided, that task of that aggregate task of reducing CO2 emissions. I give 3 examples, 3 classical ways of distributing these permits. The first is to put it in an auction, and then in fact you get very close to the pricing solution that Pigou had in mind. You may also decide, and that was what Paul has in mind, to give it to the initial emitters. And that will be a way to smoothen the burden of having to restrict the emissions. So there can be a politically very wise way of dealing with it. But for other externalities, you may also decide not to give it to the emitters, but to give it to the victims. Think of noise annoyance. And that will be a way to express that there is not a right for car drivers to emit noise, but there is a right for people to live in a quiet environment. So you can, as a government, really be very transparent about the fairness and the equity objectives that you have. The second noteworthy aspect that I want to address here today is that the Pigouvian tax, it's efficient. So, and with that, I really mean that it addresses the beyond GDP type of welfare measures. It's efficient for 2 distinct reasons. One is that it achieves the optimal volume of remaining traffic or of remaining CO2 emissions. But the second one is at least as important from the perspective of broad welfare. And that is not only the optimal total amount of emissions that we achieve, but we also make sure that the target is reached using the optimal composition of remaining traffic, because people will have the incentive to maintain the trips that bring them the highest benefits. And that makes economic instruments such as tradable permits more desirable from the welfare perspective than non-economic instruments, such as, for instance, the number plate policy, where depending on the last digits of your number plate, you are not allowed to drive at certain days. So tradable permits maintain that attractive aspect of Pigouvian taxation. And the third one, and that's the big disadvantage of Pigouvian taxation, and that's also why we see so little applications in reality, is that it leads to an increase in what we call generalized prices, because optimal tolls are imposed. Driving becomes more expensive. And in fact, in the most simple textbook model, everybody except for the regulator would be worse off from the imposition of road pricing before the regulator uses the tax revenues and redistributes them. Now, I'm not an expert in political sciences, but I can tell you, if you design a policy that makes everybody worse off except for the government, you will have little chance to have this accepted in a democracy. So that's the paradox of Pigouvian pricing. And also this can be considerably softened with tradable permits, because the permits can be distributed beforehand for free. Now, as Paul already indicated, tradable permits in road transport, they have gained interest since the late 1990s, and there's been a lot of research. So even though I think this initiative should be applauded for really trying to take this instrument to a practical application, there's also the comfort of having a solid body of economic research and also traffic engineering research looking at the ins and the outs of this instrument. So it is not that we are looking at something that is totally wild, totally new. There's already a lot of research going on. I list here, and the slides can be made available afterwards, a number of authors. On the bottom row, you see real-life experiments where I've done quite a few together with also Kushin Gang. So I promised her not to say anything about these experiments, because this is what her presentation will be about. Overarching conclusions from these experimental studies looking at tradable permits is, first of all, participants understand and use the system as intended. So some of you may fear that the tax may have the disadvantages that I explained, but it's a lot simpler to understand. And tradable permits may sound like something that's very complicated. In fact, what turned out is that people very easily, in a couple of weeks, get used to the idea of using tradable permits, and then they use and understand the system as it is intended from theory. They also do so in a rational way. With that, I mean that the way that they deal and trade these permits shows that they understand exactly what they are doing. Transaction cost, a big fear if you talk about tradable permits, can be minimized. But here's an important trade-off. The more you rely on automated trading, the greater the risk of losing participants' engagement in the system. So here is really a field for optimization, maintaining engagement while reducing transaction cost. And about acceptability, it is higher than for regular pricing, as one would expect. And what we also saw is that it grows, acceptability grows through the use of the system. So if you compare the acceptability before experiments and then for the same people after having been subject to the tradable permits, the studies that we have done show that the acceptability increases. Now, finally, what about the straw man? Of course, after this introduction, you will not be surprised to hear that I find it a very interesting proposal and one that is consistent with much of what I've just said in favor of tradable permits. But we are here to discuss. So let me raise two, I think, interesting discussion points that we can address. First of all, is that there is already emissions trading of CO2 in New Zealand. And that raises the question, what is it that justifies or that requires on top of existing emissions trading, a higher CO2 price in road transport than in other realms of economic behavior. Why should we have a different CO2 price from some activities, namely road transport, than in other activities? I think that is something to be addressed, because that is something where you would really need to have your defense in order if you want to sell this idea, so to speak. And a mirror image question is this: why not broaden the instrument to more fields of consumption? And the one I'm in particular thinking of is flying. Now, it's just a guess, because I have never been to New Zealand. My guess is that people from New Zealand fly a lot. Of course, I'm not saying anything new. That also involves a lot of CO2 emissions. And perhaps we want people to trade off emissions in flying with emissions of car use. But there are other fields of consumer behavior that involve CO2 emissions as well. So I think these are questions that we might be able to discuss today. This is where I would like to stop. Paul, I'm looking at the clock. I'm worried that I took more than I got. And that's because you should have made speaking time tradable.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. That was brilliant. But let's see, are there any questions for Eric? And I see, Graham, you've got your hand up.
Yep. In your last slide, you posed two questions, one of which is, why should New Zealand, which is where the example comes from, pay a higher charge than elsewhere? I'm assuming you mean elsewhere in the world?
No.
Elsewhere in the economy.
Exactly. So if you put so the strawman idea would have an additional trading system for CO2 emissions from road transport on top of an existing tradable permit system for CO2 emissions. So that means that the combined result would be a higher charge in road transport for the same kilos of CO2 than elsewhere in the economy. So for instance, than in electricity use at home, or whichever example you would like to have. And I think that is Paul and me have been briefly discussing this, but I think it's an important question, and I think it's also something that we might discuss today. But so short answer is, with elsewhere, I don't mean elsewhere in the world, I mean other sectors in the economy.
So just coming back on that, at the moment, there is an excise tax on fuel, petrol tax. When the road user charge system comes in, that fuel tax, which people pay at the pump when they buy their petrol, that will go away. That will cease. That's my understanding. So there is a bit of a trade-off there from the point of view of the consumer. Does that address your concern or not?
It would entirely if fuel would not be subject to CO2 trading in New Zealand. And my understanding from the earlier discussion is that it will be. But I'm relying on what I understand of this. So if I'm wrong here, then we can easily settle the discussion. But I think, so my understanding is it will be subject to the overall CO2 trading. And then on top of that, there will be an additional system.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, thank you, Eric. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Keishin Geng. As I started my own research into this topic, I was excited to find that Keishin had written a doctoral thesis in 2025, which means it was the most current thinking, which is what I wanted to find on this topic. So Keishin is a research fellow at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. She recently received a PhD, that PhD I mentioned, in economics jointly from a Beijing Jiaotong University and VU Amsterdam. Her doctoral research focused on the effectiveness of tradable mobility permits in managing rush hour congestion and travelers' decision-making processes regarding travel time uncertainties, using a combination of surveys, field experiments, and economic modeling. She's published in leading journals such as Transportation Research Part A, Part B, and Part D, and Transport Policy. Her current works include the acceptance of tradable mobility permits and the potential of tradable permit schemes in residential electricity consumption. Kei-Shin, the floor is yours, virtually.
Thank you, Paul. Let me try my screen share. Thank you, Paul, for your invitation, and thank you, Eric, for the general introduction of the tradable permits. So I'm going to share a case study of tradable mobility permits. So in this work, we're designing a tradable rush hour permits, and it is the co-work with my two supervisors, Eric Wolhoff and also Yashan Wang. She's also in the chat. So in this work, we want to design tradable rush hour permits to manage the morning rush congestions in Beijing. So the concept of this tradable rush hour permit scheme is that the government will allocate certain number of permits to each driver for free, and the charging permits to car drivers who drive in the congested time period and the road sections, and the permits can be traded among car drivers in an open market there, and the market price of permits is dynamic. So that is a brief introduction of these permits. And so to test the effectiveness of such a new scheme, we use a random field experiment. So that is the methodology that win the Nobel Member Prize in economics. So by this field experiment, we can allow travelers to make decisions in real policy scenarios. So in this case, in the Beijing real road scenarios. And we implement different interventions. So in this experiment, besides the tradable permits, we also design a comparable congestion charge to better analyze. So to like a baseline control book to say what the effectiveness of the tradable permit scheme. And by this field experiment, we can also compare the real behavior difference between, like I said before, the control group and also the experimental group. And we can do some causal interference analysis based on this data. So to implement this field experiment, it is based on this smart driver app and a smart driving box equipment. So that is a company in Beijing. So they have more than 30,000 users in Beijing, and all these users are specially randomized, and they are from different districts of Beijing with different brands of cars. So it's very good samples. And we use an onboard equipment, so it's called the OBD box, to collect and record the vehicle status data like GPS and their vehicle health, something like that, the data in real time. So for the permits design, here we design two style kind of rush hour permit. So if the users depart for their daily first trip during the peak, the central peaks. So in Beijing, it's from 7 to 8. They need to pay 2 permits. And if they depart during the shoulder peak, it's like 6:30 to 7 and 8 to 8:30. They need to pay 1 permit. And all other times, they don't need to pay any permits. And we set the initial permit price to 10 yuan based on our pre-service. And for the initial allocations, all these permits were free allocated. So that is the way we think that easy to be accepted for such new policy and is suitable for the experiment setting. And the number of initial permits in this study is based on their historical travel data. So if people travel more, they will receive more permits at the beginning. But we control the initial permits, the monetary value of the initial permit, and all the other monetary budget for each users are the same. So we control all this total monetary value to be the same to exclude other income effects for the permits. And here is the design for the trading market. So in this experiment, we use an online permit bank. So the permit price will change automatically towards the predefined target, and the users can trade at any time and anywhere of these permits. So that is the functions we use for this permits. So here, day t is the permits possessed by users at time t, and q is the predefined target for that week, and ut is the cumulative usage for that week. So like on the right side, the q minus ut is like what the gap between the current stage and or predefined target. So that is we call this supply side. And the ZT, the permits possessed by users, is like the current demand side of the permits. So when the demand is larger than the supply, the price will increase. And when the demand is lower than the supply, the permits price will decrease. So that is the logic of these functions here. And we also have some other limitations to avoid undesirable speculations for this permit market. For example, for the tradings, we limited that per person, one person can only trade one permit per time. And we also have a small transaction fee for each transaction. And for their daily positions, we're limited to that the number of permits deposited cannot be larger than the left days multiple 2. So that is the maximum number of permits they can use for the left days. And they also limited that for each user, if their transactions is larger than 3 per day, the additional 3s will not affect the price. So that avoid like one person affect the permit market. And for the tradable markets, they can be automatically bought and deducted based on travelers' real-time behaviors. So here is the app screens we use. So this app screens is linked with the OBD box I just introduced. So the real-time behaviors will reflect just in this app screen. So here in the main screen, they will say my current monetary budget and my current permits budget. And they will say the current price of the permits, and there's also a small transaction fee. And they can also check the historical records of their transaction, their chips, and for each time they need to like choose like buy permits, and there's a confirmation screen here. Are you sure to buy one, or are you sure to sell one here? So that is the screens we used in this experiment. So here's the group design. In this experiment, we totally have 4 groups. So besides the tradable permits group, as I said, we also have a comparable congestion charge group. So for the congestion charge intervention, we also designed a 2-step size congestion charge. So for the shoulder peak, they need to pay 10 yuan. So you can say here the 10 yuan is the same as the initial permits price we set. And for the center peak, they need to pay 20 yuan. And besides the tradable permits group and the congestion charge group, we also have another, we call this congestion charge and tradable permits group. So for this group, they need to use the congestion charge first, and then they use the tradable permits. So based on their response to the first congestion charge months, we will calculate their peak avoidance rate among all these participants. And this data will be used to set the total number of the initial permits. So for example, in this experiment, we found that in the month 1, the CCTP group, they decrease 15% of their compared to their historical behavior. So that is the target we use to decide the initial allocation of the permits. Okay, so for the participant recruitment, we screen out 20,000 travelers based on their departure time, their destinations, travel frequency, and car ownership. So we only select persons that are frequency morning commuters, and they only have 1 car. And for the first round, we recruit the samples by like app notification and send some messages and also phone calls to recruit samples for the CCTP group. And for month 2, we randomly allocated the other participants into different kind of groups. So in total, we have 358 valid samples, and based on the pre-survey, we include users who have multiple vehicles and who are taxi drivers and who have long-term plan to leave Beijing during the experiment period. And all these groups are balanced in terms of age, gender, and also their residential place, income, travel distance, and departure time. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So here we can see that is the figure about the departure time distribution in month 0. So that is the before the experiment. And the month 2 is after all these treatments. So here we can see the green line is the control group and all the other lines is the incentives group. So based compared to the control group, we can see for the treatment group, their number of rush hour trips significantly decreased, and the distribution of their departure times has a higher variance. So we can see their peak now is moved earlier, so towards the shorter peak. And when then design a regression model to test the statistical effectiveness. So here we calculated each user's number of points. So if they depart during the central peak, they will count 2 points. And if they depart in the shorter peaks, they will count 1 point. So we calculated the day average number of points for each users. And the independent variables we used here is the difference in the day average number of points between the incentive week and the month average. So here we can see the coefficient is negative. So that is the wonderful news we know. The tradable permits has a statistically significant effect on travelers' peak avoidance behavior. So that means the tradable permits, yes, they decrease the number of points they use, so decrease the peak trips in our experiment. And for the pod models that contains all participants, is model 1 to model 3, we can see that the coefficient for tradable permits is a little bit lower. The absolute value is a little bit lower than it for congestion charge. So that says that tradable permits appear somewhat lower than of the congestion price, and especially for individuals who seem to be least engaged by just letting automatically transactions deal with their permits. But this difference disappears when we focus on participants who have experienced both congestion charge and tradable permits, like here in model 7. So you can see here the coefficient for the tradable permits and the congestion charge would be much more similar here. So that is suggested that maybe some individual characteristics play a significant role in this revealed effectiveness of these two instruments. So we also want to highlight the importance of enhanced users' engagement in the permit markets. So here, when we see the interactions, here is the manually transaction with the tradable permits incentives. We can see here, if people they manually trade, they actually play with the market, they could further they will decrease, they will use less permits during the experiment period. So that means the enhanced usage engagement in the permit market could further strengthen the tradable permits effectiveness. And besides the effectiveness, I will also check the permits market here. So here we can see the blue bars means the cumulative buys for each group, and the red bars is the cumulative sales for each group, and the green lines measures the day ending price. So here we found that yes, the market seems works well. So when the buys is larger than the sales, the price increase over time. And when the sales is larger than the buys, the price decrease over time. So that is the good news. And we also have some questions in the poster survey. So we asked whether they want to buy a permit and saw the permit price was falling. Did you decide to wait with buying? And most people say yes. So when they say the price was falling, they wait to buy, and when they sell the permits, what price was raising, they also wait to sell. So that means most people can rationally trade with the permits. And we also asked that to what extent did you consciously decide to use permits on days where a voting peak would bring the greatest inconvenience to you? And also most people say that they're consciously or strongly consciously to use such permit scheme. We also asked about their acceptability about these two kind of incentives. So in total, most people agree that so most people said that they think the tradable permits are more acceptable than the congestion charge. So you can see here for the congestion charge, is before the experiment, just 15% of users agree or strongly agree to implement such incentives. And for the tradable permits is 25%. And for both incentives, when they have experienced a little bit during the experiment, their acceptability increase after this experiment. And for most of this experiment, so it's about 60% of our samples, they agree or strongly agree that tradable permits could be better than congestion charge in general. And most of them believe that compared to congestion charge, tradable permits are better in terms of acceptability, fairness, and also effectiveness in relieving the traffic congestion, and also the effectiveness in reducing the environmental pollution. So here is the brief conclusion of this case study. So we found that tradable permits works well in the road rush hour traffic congestion. It can affect the free market outcome to better reflect scarcity. That is what we want, and improve users' activity level. So improve their engagement in the permit market is a very important way to enhance the effectiveness of tradable permits. So if they can trade more actively, the permits can be more effectively, even more than the congestion charge. And in the long run, the effectiveness of tradable permit may even better when travelers are familiar with the tradable permit scheme. And for most participants, permits are more acceptable than the congestion charge. So that is the final slide I have. As Eric said before, so we have a series of experiments. So the first one is the Brian's 2021, and in this paper you can find more details of the design of the tradable market, and we have a lab in the field experiment to test its effectiveness, and we also have the parking permits and compass permits, and also this is the road field experiment, and as introduced by Paul, we also have ongoing work in the tradable electric permits for the household. So when I first saw Paul's email, I feel very excited to see that New Zealand also have such proposal to test the tradable mobility permits in real life. And I hope our empirical experiments can give you some support and insight. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question for Keishan or a comment? That, for me, that was very, very interesting, Keishan, and thank you for that, explaining the experiment. We'll go on in a few minutes to discuss your thoughts on how you might experiment to test the interest or the level of success of TMERS, but I thought very interesting because traffic congestion is a problem here, and what I'm hearing you say is that your work is suggesting that tradable permits would be preferable to a congestion charge, a toll. Is getting that correct?
Yeah.
Graham, you've raised your hand.
Following on directly from Paul's comment, there is discussion about a congestion charge coming in New Zealand, but it would only be in congested urban areas. Whereas if there was the tradable permit scheme, presumably that would apply everywhere in high density and low density areas. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I think we have a similar discussion before with Paul, but I think for the tradable emission permits, so that is for, like you said, is for a broader area, and for the congestion charge, it's like only for the congestion. And what I think is we need to notice that when congestion is also some emissions happened, so it's important to like divide it to clarify the sub goals for each kind of initiative. So if we have a very clean clarification between this kind of initiative, that will be fine. But if we have some overlap between the emission permits and also the rush or the congestion charge, that may be some problem. Maybe people will say that you have I have already paid for the congestion. Why I also need to use such permits? So that is also one comments from all participants. So we have open questions for participants who disagree with the tradable permits. And one just said, we have already paid for the field tax. So why I also need to pay such rush or permits or the congestion charge? So I think that is it's depend on or ghost citing, and yeah.
It's not really a question for Kushin, but just to follow up on the question of what happens if you have tradable permits as a congestion management strategy versus as a CO2 emissions strategy. One of the things I think to keep in mind is that it's important to not overload people with all sorts of tradable permit schemes for all sorts of behavior that they have. And one of the things that our experiment, I think, has shown, the one that Kushin now presented, is that, for instance, by charging more permits for a trip in the center of the peak compared to the shoulder of the peak, you can really make the instrument more refined. And of course, you could also try and combine CO2 objectives with congestion management objectives. So the same permits, if you would have indeed automated detection of where and when vehicles drive, of course you need that, otherwise you can't do it. But if you would have that, you could charge more permits at the moment that people drive in congested places at congested times. And in that way, you could avoid the possible risks of having too many stacked tradable permit systems. Because I think, we can think of zillions of reasons and many realms of life where you would like to affect behavior, but it has to remain manageable for the traveler. And in the way that I just explained, you could do that.
Thanks, Eric. And now let's just open this general conversation then, please. Bo, you've got your hand up.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. So I'm a PhD student in New Zealand, and I just want to ask, because I see that the scheme that Paul has proposed is a distance-based charge, and the policy that Kushin has proposed is probably an area-based charge, because I see the congestion pricing policy implemented in Manhattan, New York, is an area-based charge. So what is the difference between these two? And I just want to listen to your opinion on that. Thank you.
I can first of all say, Bo, when you say a distance-based, it's a distance-based times vehicle rating, because the distance base is the RUC, which is separate from the proposed tradable rights. But I think your question is good in terms of the area that's covered. Keishan or Eric, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I think it's because of the different objective of the policies. So for the rush or permits, we are focused on the congestion in that area, and also it's depend on the time. So that is why it's area depend and also the time depend. But for the emission permits, it is emission itself is linked with the distance that people trip, and also linked with the fuel consumptions. So that is why maybe distance-based and the fuel-based is more suitable for that case.
Yeah, and if I can add something to that, just like, so if you try to imagine, and I call it an old-fashioned road pricing system, but it's old-fashioned because it's more than a century old, the ideas, but of course it would be modern technology. If you try to imagine that and how you would differentiate prices over time of day, over space, also higher for some areas, as you indicate, than for other areas, also reflecting CO2 emissions, all those dimensions you could also have in a tradable permit system. So in fact, because in the end, the incentive that you give, you can define it in the same way as you would define a road pricing system. There is, I think it's safe to say there's nothing you can do with road pricing you couldn't do with tradable permits.
And the evidence is that tradable permits are preferable to the people who are the object of the system.
Well, yeah, but that is the participant. So one of the things that's interesting to see, and I hinted at it in my presentation, is that beforehand, people can fear that it's a very complicated system. So there can be more resistance beforehand. And that is why I think that demonstration projects, and that might also be, but again, for me, it's hard to judge whether that would be feasible in New Zealand. But demonstration projects would be, I think, fantastic to be able to show the effectiveness, to show if it works, but also to overcome these issues of, all sorts of, fears that people may have beforehand about how complex it is, how difficult to understand, and all other sorts of, also technical workings. So will the system work? Is it resistant against fraud? All those things. I think it would be good to think about demonstration projects of the proof of concept.
Yeah, just to follow up once. Yeah, in the campus experiment we have, so it is about some student samples. We get some 3 lectures before we really conduct this experiment. So for that samples, we have a very high good evaluation, like they feel that tradable permits is very accessible and it's not very complex to use at the beginning. But for the road experiment, we cannot have such lectures because it's quite a lot of people and they're like real road users. So we don't have such things. So we found we have a least support on the complexity or easy to use, and also less support on the accessibility. But it's very interesting that we found that all this evaluation, all this public accessibility, and also whether the field is easy to use, all these things is increased after they really try this kind of permits. So I think it's important and it's maybe useful to let them just play with it, maybe for quite a 1 hour, a half an hour, and have a very brief explanation of that, and give them some chance to file. Oh, it's not very difficult to use that. So maybe that will help the real effectiveness of these permits after they real implement. Yeah.
And if I can follow, I don't want to dominate too much this session, but if I can briefly follow up on that, it matches, in fact, insights that we have from road pricing applications, that acceptance increases after implementation of the system. And it has been recorded in London, in Stockholm. And it has to do with the fact that also the opponents of this sort of measure are very successful in making voters and citizens believe that the instrument is just meant, to get your money, and you will be paying money and you will still be stuck in traffic. And of course, there are many arguments against that, but the best way to overcome that type of resistance is to demonstrate. And that is, I think, also what we see at a very small scale in our experiment, where indeed the acceptance increases over time.
David, you have a question.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to, thanks for the research and the presentation and the call, of course. I just have a basic question. The permits are distributed based on past driving, previous driving, is that correct?
Keisha.
Yeah, and it's correct. It's based on their historical travels. Yeah.
And then the person who is choosing not to drive is selling their permit. They are the beneficiary of the sale. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then you're surveying those people. Do they prefer this versus congestion pricing? Who is being surveyed?
Yeah.
So to me, that I would ask, that may bias these results, because in terms of preferability, because in the case of congestion pricing, the public is the beneficiary of the revenue from pricing, whereas in this case, you've created a short run, I'm assuming, beneficiary that is the person who drove in a previous period. So to me, it's logical that they would prefer that system, because now they're benefiting from the pricing scheme, rather than in congestion pricing where the public is the benefit. Am I understanding it correctly? Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. So for this survey, so now the survey results is for all the participants. So not all people is benefit from this permits. So somebody, they buy more, and somebody, as you said, they sell some permits and earn more monies. But I think that for the next step is what we are some ongoing work is to say that what kind of persons would more like to have such permit scheme. So I think, as you said, this like whether they are the benefits or they are the winners or they are the losers will affect these results. So yeah, thank you. I think it's very important to say that. So maybe for the persons that they need to buy more and they're the losers of this permit scheme, they don't like this permits after the experiment.
I agree with what you say. It is important to keep in mind, though, that of course the road pricing system allows one to redistribute the revenues. The point is that even though that can be the case, and even though you can, try to convince people that it's true, that it leads to an increase in social welfare if you do this, the resistance is enormous. And I think one of the things that makes tradable permits more acceptable to voters and to the public at large is the fact that it's built in the system that the revenues will indeed be redistributed upfront by handing out these permits. So the fact, you can wonder, why is it that people consistently vote against policies that would increase social welfare? It's an important question. And I think good economy and good economists would ask that question, would not say people don't get it right, they're stupid. No, you should wonder, why is it that people don't believe that? And there is, at least, let me speak for the Netherlands, an important reason that people simply distrust governments to use the revenues in a way that will benefit them. And one of the strong points of tradable permits is that you make you make immediately clear how the revenues will be redistributed. And I think the mechanisms of, for instance, why in the EU we see emissions trading for firms, and why the EU succeeded to have that and not CO2 pricing, I think it's the same sort of mechanism.
Thanks, Eric. I just want to check quickly with Bo that you got a good answer, that you got an answer to your question.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. And so Zia Wadud, I'm going to recognize Zia to speak, and I'll just mention that Zia is the first keynote speaker in part 2 of this session. Welcome, and I look forward to introducing you more fully at the start of the second session. Zia, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. What Eric and Keshing said, I more or less agree. I have just one quick question about the experiment, which is a really interesting one, and I've seen Keshing's presentation in the past as well. A very interesting piece of work. Keshing, your permits are based on past use, right? Like grandfather permit type thing. But I'm just wondering, when they were in the marketplace, did you actually reduce the total amount of vehicle miles traveled or something so that there is a scarcity, or where it was the same, total VMT was still the same?
Yeah, we really reduced the total number of permits they used. Yeah.
David.
The other question I had is, in the example of so Paul, from what I gathered from your presentation, the permit beneficiaries would be a general public that is receiving the flow of funds equitably from the revenues. Is that the distinction between what you're proposing and one distinction between what you're proposing and the pilot? Would individuals in the public be assigned permits under your scheme?
In the TMERS, the proposal is that the public would all receive permit allocations or rights allocations, whereas I think in Keishin's experiment, the existing drivers receive them. And there's two logics there. The first is just general public acceptability, but in fact, the right to drive and the right to hold a driver's license and to own a car and drive a car is something we already have. And we want to, essentially through this process, we're constraining that right to make fossil fuel emissions. And that right hasn't been captured or crystallized in any way. And the idea of issuing to everybody is that it would crystallize that right. So having received the rights, then people who don't need to use them can sell them. At the moment, people who forego driving don't get any benefit from everybody else who would drive. And so the logic, I think, of this solution is that they continue to hold that right because they've received it chopped up, if you like, into pieces they can use. They've continued to receive that right. They can use that or they can sell it.
Well, one suggestion that I have for these schemes is that looking at the experiment, there is a burden placed on the permit holder to time when they want to make the transaction to sell the permit, right? That's a new job that they have to optimize the sale of that permit. Is how I understood your presentation, from the example group. And one thing that I was thinking is that if the permit holders are thought to be the general public, it might make sense to consider an alternative where permits are sold 30 days in advance of the trip to a general market. And then that can open up trading, after which there can be a secondary market to trade permits. But that people have made an active decision to hold those permits. the general public gets the beneficiaries of the permit, the initial permit sales, and then the holder of the permit can time when they'd like to sell their permit, because they've expressed an interest in these permits that they're then going to sell to someone who's, either they're going to use it themselves or sell it to someone else who's going to use it. So if you're an active commuter, you've secured your commute well in advance, or you're an organization that needs to supply, trips to, for your own operations or your own commuters, you've secured your access to it. But then at a later point, those, if seeing the anticipated congestion, you choose to sell at a later time, then, those are priced, in a market that is closer to usage for people that are on the margin of using it or not. And that, to me, has a benefit because it appropriately puts the burden of when to sell on people who want to participate in the market, rather than people who are being granted permits that they might not actually have an intention to sell. I don't know if that makes sense or if people have followed that, but to me, you have this dilemma. If you're going to assign it to prior users, grandfather it to prior users, then that sort of gives them a false, you're sort of granting them the public good that you might not want to assign to people just because they drove. Whereas if you're assigning it to the general public, then it puts a burden on the general public that they may not want, in terms of timing and sale. You could just open up a window for sales of permits for a period in advance, and then you can trade those permits there forward, and people that are participating in the market can trade, can sell or hold them and use them as they wish. It's just a suggestion in terms of how to address this issue of how to assign them.
Okay, thanks, David. I think I catch what you're saying. I think it's a good idea. I think you're talking more specifically about a congestion style permit or than an emissions permit. But I do take the point about the burden of deciding when to sell, if to sell, which I would just suggest maybe is overcome by the fact that people will be talking about the price, and you might choose to convert your unneeded surplus into money. Graham's got his hand up, and then I would like to ask a question of our experts, just in terms of focusing on the idea of TMERS and what sort of an experiment you would design if that was what you were going to pursue, rather than a combined solution. But so, Martin, would you like to raise your question, please?
Yeah. Thanks. I found that idea very interesting, to have tradable permits. I wonder if you, especially in New Zealand, consider kind of a closed market for mobility options to trade this. So, for example, if you avoid using your car, you could use the permits and buy a ticket for public transport, or sharing a car and pay for the sharing costs of it. So to target this specifically to mobility.
Thanks for that question. And I think what you're suggesting in essence is that the permits would become an alternate currency.
Yes.
And you could do that, or you could route it through money, through turning them into cash and then using the cash to make the same choice. But I've certainly thought about how public transport might decide that they'll accept rights in payment. They'd have to do technology solutions to enable that. But yeah, I see what you're suggesting.
And a quick question: is there any other state working on this kind of schema already?
I'll ask Eric Zia if you're aware. Is anybody working on this something similar to this anywhere in the world?
As far as I know, where there is thinking of let's say, more sophisticated ways of pricing, it is road pricing. And there we have this recurring pattern of road pricing proposals being made, debates being held, and then in the end, the proposals are being disbanded. So I think it is time, and time is becoming more pressing to think about what is it, to think more carefully about what is it in road pricing, in the pricing of externalities that people dislike, and what can we do in order to overcome that. And of course, we are here to discuss CO2 permits, and that is an issue that's becoming more and more urgent. So if we wait for the people to embrace road pricing, it may be too late.
From my side, I don't think I have seen tradable permit type schemes, but as Eric mentioned in the beginning, the issue of flying is becoming really, really important, and there are pushes from various citizen forums and NGO and environmental NGOs on creating some sort of cap. They haven't talked about the trade part of it, but creating some sort of cap or some sort of flight levy, depending on how much you travel. These are not exactly a tradable permit type thing, but the concept of budgeting. I mean, tradable permit means there's a cap, basically, right? And so that is, I mean, I'm from Bangladesh, of course, and in this part of the world, in the Western world, like anything cap is not seen as positive, right? But you could see that there are some pressure groups who have started pushing in this direction in general, that there should be a budget or there should be a cap, which whether they can be permitted, it can be traded, that hasn't been discussed much, at least in the UK, but cap has been being discussed, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Martin. Now, we're running close to the end of our 90 minutes. As I said before, we're not going to stop if this conversation carries on. It's very, very interesting, and it's great to have all these questions. My question now for Keishin and Eric is, if you were to not, I mean, I do understand you're saying that you think we should combine something to do with congestion with something to do with emissions. If you were to not do that, if you were to just focus on the TMERS, what sort of a demonstration project or experiment, have you got any thoughts on what that would look like? How you would set something like that up for the benefit of eventually, supposedly, as long as it works, gaining support politically for a solution like this?
Yeah, maybe I go first. So I think for any experiment or for any new policies like this, it's always good to just have a small sample size first and do some pilot first. And if I understand correctly, in the TMERS, actually we want to compare the not compare. So we want to use the tradable emission permits to replace the FED, so the fuel tax. So it's not correct.
No, the RUC will replace the Fed. That's going to happen anyway. The problem is the impact on emissions of doing that is potentially large, and why we need to do something, why I perceive that we need to do something as a result.
Let's see. So it's like now we use ROC and tradable emission permits to replace the FED. That is correct. Is it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe you can have a small sample size pilot, as you said, in an area that for that area you first you don't need to pay the FED, but you have the ROC and the tradable permits. Then you can compare maybe you can choose another similar area. So then you have like a control group, and you then have a treatment group. So you see whether the emissions and maybe also other goals for this premise, whether these goals, the object you have achieved is similar to what you have in the area you still use the FED policy. So by this comparison, you can see whether ROC and emission permits can be a replacement of the FED. So that is the first idea here. So Eric, please come in.
Yeah. Yeah, so my understanding is that with the RUC, you also already have in place that there is, between quotation marks, official checking of the odometers to check on the total mileage or kilometrage that is being driven. So you already have a lot in place, I think, to make an experiment where you, and yeah, Kushin is modest and says a small sample size. I'm greedy, so a somewhat bigger sample size, because that's, good for the experiment. And also, if you want to really identify how does this instrument work out differently for different income classes, depending on spatial aspects, where do people live, where do they work? There are a lot of questions and a lot of possible concerns that you could address. But the fact that you already have the measurement of the behavior that you want to affect in place, that really simplifies, I think, the execution of the project. And of course, the next thing I'm going to say, you should take with a grain of salt. Kushin and me, and also Yasan, who is in this meeting, we've had a series of projects with a specific type of design of the market for tradable permits, and we think that it's working well. And others may have other ideas, but just from our perspective, I think if you would indeed have this sort of experiment, the market design that we have could more or less directly be used. So you would have solved that. A lot is already in place, and if either a national government or a regional government or perhaps even a local government would be interested to see how does this instrument actually affect behavior, knowing that with an experiment you can only have short-run responses, right? People will not change cars. Those are the responses that you would have in the longer run, and you can't get them in a small experiment or in an experiment of a couple of months or whatever. But the short-run behavioral impacts are already interesting. I think you could, just do that in the same way as that we have been doing the congestion charging experiment in Beijing. You don't need a lot. You need a research budget. You need a budget to make sure that people who are now supposed to be voluntarily part of something that later on will not be voluntarily. But now, of course, you need money to convince people to be part of the experiment. So you would need a research budget, but it's not a spectacularly big research budget. So I think it can be done. And then in collaboration with the government, whether it's national or regional or urban government, who may have their own concerns, for instance, concerns about how to allocate these rights. Should it be in proportion with historic mileage, or should there be other, principles of fairness, of equity? And mind you, we as economists cannot say what is fair. That is a political matter. So there are all sorts of questions underlying this tradable permit system that you could also address in such an experiment. And if you couple it with questionnaires where you ask people's perceptions, ideas about what is fair, I think there's a lot of information that you could get. But as I indicated also in my presentation, demonstration projects are really helpful. And the things that we have done also in the Netherlands also, again, raise interest among firms. There are even firms who are thinking of, greening the mobility of their employees using tradable permit type of approaches. So it is I think you call it a bandwagon effect. If more, yeah, okay. But you should start somewhere.
We just need that research budget.
Yeah.
John Niles, you look like you're speaking, but we can't hear you because you're on mute.
I think it's been a robust discussion. I think it's been very interesting. The international perspective. It's a complicated question, of course. The implementation is complicated enough, but there's the whole basic idea of getting it done. I'm thinking of my own country, where the whole idea, I was trying to stir people's interest in this session just by raising the whole idea of an emissions cap. It's like, wow, in the United States, that would be tough, but it's wonderful to see that there's a lot of work on the table to get going on this, to think through how you do it. So no one can say, well, I can't see how you could possibly do it. It may be it's a matter of getting the idea out there, and we know how to do this in some way, but you do have to get the political will to do this. And I did pick up on that point being made that once you do this and people see that it works, it's working. I mean, it's the story is being told in the United States now of how well congestion, that lower Manhattan congestion zone is working in New York City. I mean, the evidence is just piling up so fast. It's like, hey, it works. It's got to get it going. And I think in this emissions area, the numbers look pretty bad, for the short term. I think at some point people are going to realize that we've all got to do it, and to get an example going in New Zealand, an example for the world would be a wonderful thing, or in China or in the Netherlands. I mean, let's stay on the topic. So I think this will carry over nicely into our session about 12 hours from now, and we'll see if we can get something going. Congratulations to everybody here.
Thank you, John. Vivek, you had your hand up for a moment and you took it down. Have you got something you wanted to say?
Yeah, and I clapped by mistake, not because it wasn't a great presentation, it was. I just hit the wrong icon. But I did have a question about, I'm doing a ride-sharing startup here in the States, and much of my thinking in the years leading up to forming a company and funding it was around incentives. Because every time I saw another effort, the common problem that I saw in other ride-sharing incentives, other ride-sharing efforts, was the issue of there not being a strong enough incentive. And I think David very well touched on this whole idea of liquidity. Will these permits actually feel like money in your hands, which you can either use or get rid of on your own timetable? I mean, the way in my mind that this fabulous idea comes to fruition is if you can not just address all of the perception problems, and there are many that you've spoken about, some valid, some manufactured in one's minds, but also practically create such compelling monetary incentives that are immediate to people. If you throw money at people, they'll catch it. Most people will catch the money if you throw it at them. And so the way I would continue to think about your straw man and sell it to the powers that be, we know there are billions of dollars of savings that are going to accrue to regulatory agencies and city organizations and we know those savings are in the billions. Forget about climate change and forget about emissions. There's billions of dollars that are going to be saved if you can get these folks to be singing your praises in such a powerful way. And so I just wanted to share with you that the thinking that I constantly go through over and over again is money, 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 incentives, incentives, incentives. And if you can design something that works on a very small scale, that puts money in people's pockets or allows them to, as David said, get rid of these things that they don't want or need, then I think everything that you're doing is just fabulous. And so the way I'll continue to think about this, and I have more thoughts that I'll send back to you, Paul, is, what's the ideal resident driver in New Zealand going to look like in this system a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and work backwards from that, And maybe you've already done this, but I just wanted to share that thinking. Thanks a lot. I think it's great.
Look, thank you everybody very much for sticking in with this for more than the 90 minutes. That's always great to say there must have been something good going on. I appreciate this so much because it's something I'm working on and keen to give it some chance of success. And I think that the conversation we've heard today has just been very, very valuable and very useful. And I just so much appreciate not only our keynote speakers for doing a great job, but also for everybody for participating and for your questions and comments. I look forward to sending you the highlights reel and the video and the presentations, which will include in the end both this session and the one that's going to start in nearly 10 hours time, just over 10 hours time. Thank you all very much, and we'll close this session down now.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank
Bye-bye.
you.